New York, or more specifically, Manhattan. As does any city, New York has a rich and storied history where one of the only constants is change. The hustle never stops, and progress waits for no one. The evolution of the borough of Manhattan most clearly manifests itself in the changing landscape of neighborhoods, as seen on maps and in photographs, street names, and architectural relics. It has occurred in small steps over hundreds of years, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint exactly what changes occurred when and who or what catalyzed them. This is logical. Humans change, and metropolitan areas evolve with them. It is an organic process, as natural as a city can be considered. But what when this evolution is forced along artificially, faster than residents can actually adjust to it? Starting in the mid-19th century, not just buildings, but entire neighborhoods were incorporated into development plans, purchased using questionable eminent domain policies that allowed the city to seize property, and then razed to the ground in order to make space for what are now some of the most iconic landmarks in Manhattan. This wasn't gentrification, which, although a similar process, usually happens over a longer period. These changes were enacted in less than 5 years. And despite these drastic, sudden, and indeed traumatic changes, the neighborhoods and their fates have been mostly forgotten in public memory. Most New Yorkers aren't aware of their former existence, and they certainly don't have landmark status. In fact, the landmarks are often what replaced them. This is Lincoln Center, a hub for the fine arts in Manhattan and home to, most famously, the Metropolitan Opera. But before it was a world-famous cultural center, it was a neighborhood called San Juan Hill, home mostly to Puerto Rican residents when, in the 1950s, developer Robert Moses claimed the land under eminent domain, displacing more than 7,000 families and razing it to the ground. It survives today in the opening aerial shots and the well-known fight scenes of the 1961 movie version of West Side Story, and the sharks were based on former residents, but realistically, the neighborhood and this early example of forced gentrification were forgotten within a generation. Further uptown in Central Park, the carefully planned landscaping of 19th century architects Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux hides the former location of Seneca Village, a free black community located within current park boundaries. The maps show homes, churches, cemeteries, and a school, and residents were mostly middle class and were very politically active. Despite the park presenting as a natural green space today, nearly every aspect was meticulously planned, which also included claiming Seneca Village for the city and severely undercompensating residents for their property after other wealthy residents nearby objected to their own land being claimed. They smeared the village as a shantytown, and because of their status as Black Americans, residents of Seneca Village did not have the clout to contest this. Their houses were destroyed, and the New York Times reported that, quote, all that was left behind were cemeteries, and these, too, were soon so forgotten that nobody knows whether the bodies were ever removed. Today, Central Park is a National Historic Landscape, and while there are signs remembering the former site of Seneca Village, little is known about it in comparison to the history of the park since its construction. Penn Station is the busiest railroad station in the Western Hemisphere, but building it meant that several blocks in Midtown Manhattan had to be completely leveled, thus displacing thousands of residents, mostly Black but also Jewish, Irish, and Italian, from their homes in what was called the Tenderloin District. Residents were mostly laborers, waiters, cooks, tailors, and porters, so by day, the Tenderloin was like any working-class neighborhood. However, the district was also known for its nightlife. Bars, dance halls, casinos, and brothels served the city's elite, although they never would have admitted to it. And it was precisely this bad reputation that allowed city officials to evict residents in order to build the station. For all the hardship caused, the original station was demolished in the 1960s, rebuilt almost entirely underground, and Madison Square Garden was built on top. The list goes on. The neighborhood formerly known as Little Syria, which is much further downtown, was home to New York's first Middle Eastern community, and it was effectively destroyed to make space for the entrance ramp to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. St. George's Syrian Catholic Church still stands, but it is no longer used as a church, nor do the Lebanese and Syrian Christian refugees who attended live nearby. Their houses have been replaced by financial district buildings or otherwise repurposed. Finally, the Five Points neighborhood was first occupied by former enslaved people and then by Irish and Italian immigrants before successive immigration waves made it into a part of what is now Chinatown. Penny papers of the late 19th century dwelt upon its alleged violence and depravity, and while the neighborhood was not exactly safe, its biggest issue was not a lack of morals, but rampant poverty. Tenement buildings were overcrowded fire hazards, sanitation was appalling, and so people did what they needed to survive. Immigrants who lived there aspired to better lives in the United States, and instead they were ravaged by disease and labored under horrid conditions for very little pay. The city started its redevelopment of the area by raising a number of tenements in 1897 and building a park. However, remnants of the neighborhood still stand, including a bank-turned-funeral parlor and a church-turned-community center, as well as the Mooney House, which, along with being the oldest brick building in the city, was a saloon that was shut down. Even the intersection from which the area got its name has been mostly paved over, and ironically, courthouses, administration, and Department of Corrections buildings stand in its place. There are no signs or other commemorations for 5 Points, because nobody wanted to remember what was, by all accounts, an urban ghetto, that is to say, a poor area that the wealthy hated. So why have these places been forgotten in the public memory and resigned to, at best, a few signs? Well, it has as much to do with the people who lived there as the people who didn't. The thing that these neighborhoods had in common were that they were home to working class people, people of color, and/or immigrants. When city planners were looking for space to carry out their projects, wealthy city residents objected to their property being used, so the burden fell upon the poor, the laborers, and even those who didn't speak English, none of whom had the means to avoid it. The city used the press to degrade these neighborhoods as crime-ridden shanty towns and otherwise used fear tactics to garner support for development among the wealthy. The reputation of these neighborhoods was ruined in the public consciousness, and planners could do as they wished. And these tactics have not gone away. The way that current real estate practices work is eerily similar to the methods employed to take property from working-class residents of these forgotten neighborhoods. Although legal on paper, the ethics are more than questionable, especially when the wealthiest developers served a profit. While the various prejudices against the people who lived in these neighborhoods undoubtedly played a role in them being virtually forgotten, it's also important to remember the shifting migration patterns in the United States. The Irish and Italian immigrant waves that populated 5 Points have dried up, and Little Italy has been shrinking for years. In 2010, nobody living in Little Italy was actually born in Italy. The Syrians from Little Syria, who were really Lebanese and Palestinian Christians, have also assimilated into U.S. American culture. The descendants of black residents of Seneca Village and the Tenderloin neighborhoods have concentrated in other neighborhoods in the same way that Puerto Rican immigrants of San Juan Hill have, and most identify first and foremost as New Yorkers now. It is undeniable that assimilation was and is harder for people of color, but New York is an incredibly diverse metropolitan area where millions have found their home, even if that meant forgetting some past injustices to a certain extent. Zia Morale discusses how forgiveness makes it possible to live together by overcoming the resentment that the recollected past can produce. And in a city of over 8 million individuals with vastly different personal histories, that reconciliation of certain aspects of the city to the past is essential for daily life. These neighborhoods were indicative of humans' desire to, quote, locate themselves within smaller groups. And while this tendency will likely never disappear fully, their gradual disintegration as the lines between immigrant groups become less distinct and the city becomes more diverse exemplifies, as Miroslav Volf calls it, embracing the other, even their differences, and thus affirming them as a human and affirming their cultural particularity. Am I trying to suggest that we entirely forget the past landscape of New York, including dissolved neighborhoods like these? Of course not. They're part of the intricate tapestry of the city. It is literally built on their foundations. Besides, it isn't really possible. Remnants of these places can still be found in film, signage, street names, repurposed buildings, the list goes on, even if they are not explicitly remembered. Looking at why they are not well remembered is our job. We must be aware of the systems that made New York, acknowledging the good, the bad, and recognizing that both were necessary to create the city we know and love today.